Hello there, the wait for the War Within is finally over. Well, kinda. With the launch of the pre-patch for the War Within, we're finally getting access to at least some of the major systematic changes for the new expansion. Unfortunately, if you were looking for some content, as it seems quite a few folk were in trade chat this week, we have a little bit longer to wait. We do, however, have a bit more clarity in what content is going to be launching when. Stay tuned for my full guide to that. But first, let's dive into this week's launch and the fallout from it. As an outsider looking in, the introduction of Warband certainly looks like one of the biggest systematic changes made to World of Warcraft, possibly since the launch of the original game. And I think most folks were expecting a somewhat bumpy ride. And there certainly were a few bumps, albeit I have a suspicion that the bumps were a lot more felt by the dev team than by the players. It's a bit of a tradition that patch releases in North America will overrun only for the same release in Europe to be smooth sailing, and this was no exception, with the North America maintenance being extended multiple times and finally ending at, if I'm getting my time zones right, at 10 PM Pacific time. That was starting from 7 AM. Meanwhile, EU maintenance ended just as I was getting up in the morning, which was about 2 hours after the US did. One bit of good news for players in North America is that in compensation for the game being down for much of the day, Blizzard have announced that players with an active North American account will be getting a 1-day credit of game time to their accounts. At least one of the reasons for the dev team struggles was immediately revealed with the announcement that the Warband Bank, one of the major new features, was disabled due to what Blizzard described as a critical issue. Personally, this was the one feature that I had been most looking forward to, so not getting it in patch day has been a big disappointment. The thing that I'd been expecting to be most problematic, especially given warnings from Blizzard, was the first login process where our warbands get all set up for us. But at least for me, that was a very smooth experience. I did later on in the day start to encounter some annoying lag, and I suspect that was probably server load from other players loading in, but excluding that, honestly, it was pretty much smooth sailing. The Warband issue wasn't the only bug that became apparent though, with the ability to trade cross-realm also being disabled a day or so later, along with the reports of the Mythic raid end bosses being pretty bugged in various ways. I also personally had issues with the weekly quest, which, while offering me a choice of which of the 3 areas to do, would actually only let me pick up the Zaralet Caverns one, which, given that that was my Reef's favourite one, honestly, that was a bit annoying. Those of you who watch my news updates regularly will know that I have been critical of the level of bugs, especially in launch content, that we've been seeing in the Dragonflight expansion. And while it's tempting to jump on this as yet another example, given the scale of the changes, I'm strongly inclined to cut Blizzard a bit of a break here. Disappointing though it is to experience issues like this, overall, for what the team had to deliver, I think that some degree of issues was probably inevitable, and it could certainly have been worse. And you know, one of the reasons Blizzard do these pre-patches is to try and de-risk their main expansion launch. And I guess only time will tell if that succeeds this time. One thing I will criticise Blizzard for though is communication. Blizzard's communication when there's major issues, and having a headline piece of new content being broken at launch is major. Leaves very much to be desired, and this week has been no different, with precisely no updates on the Warband Bank issue since release, at least up until my recording of this on Friday afternoon. As much as we long-term players are used to this, for new and returning players, this gives a very poor impression of Blizzard's customer service and is highly likely to put them off. If Blizzard wants to improve their new and returning player acquisition, this is something they seriously do need to put a lot more work into. Anyway, enough ranting. The day before the patch, Blizzard finally shared some more detailed information on what content will be available during the new expansion early access period, with a fairly detailed but not quite complete schedule for the entire expansion releases. This is a bunch of new information, and I do think it is worth running through in some detail. As is traditional, the pre-patch event proper begins a little later, and we can expect that to launch with next week's reset. That's the 30th for North America and the 31st for Europe. I do have a video guide to the whole event, and I will link that down below and on screen now. But the TLDR is that it's a world event very similar to the events we've seen in Dragonflight, and offers a ton of catch-up gear with a few other cosmetic rewards. It is an improvement over the frankly lackluster Shadowlands and Dragonflight events, but it does still fall short of the heights that they reached back in the Legion and BFA events. The next date to look forward to is of course the launch of Early Access in August the 22nd. Early Access will be where the new zones and leveling experience up to level 80 opens up for purchase of the Epic Edition, along with access to the 8 new dungeons in normal difficulty only. Blizzard didn't share any information in the new Delves features, but I'm personally expecting them to be available on at least the first 2 levels of difficulty. It's also not really clear what the status of professions will be in early access. If they do open them up, gold makers at the very least will likely get some fairly significant advantages from having access to them early. On the 26th, we get the delayed access when everyone else can join, and this also marks the opening of the dungeons on heroic difficulty, and I suspect this may also be when the level 3 difficulty for Delves opens up, but again, that latter one isn't confirmed. One thing that is changing from what we've been used to in the past is that Mythic 0 dungeons will not be available until the Season 1 starts. Season 1 starts 2 weeks later on September the 10th in North America and the 11th in Europe. This is when the raid opens in normal and heroic difficulty along with the first wing of LFR and the Mythic 0 dungeons. For this season, we are seeing a return to the heroic weeks of BFA and Shadowlands, which means the Mythic raid will not be opening until the following week, but nor will Mythic Plus, which honestly is a little bit of a surprise. The start of the season is also when the Delves level 4 and above will open, albeit I am now wondering if all of the levels of difficulty for Delves will be available this week or not. The following week on the 17th or 18th, if you're in Europe, is when we get the Mythic raid, Mythic Plus and the second wing of LFR. But we're also going to get the new story mode. For those of you who are not familiar with story mode, this is a new option to allow non-raiders to finish the campaign story by fighting the final boss of the raid only on a greatly reduced difficulty, either solo or in a small group of 2 to 10 players. And the final date of the release calendar comes the following week on the 24th or 25th, depending on where you are, when the final wing of the LFR raid will be opening up. Now, at first glance, having such a long wait for Mythic Plus seems really strange, and while I am sure that the Race to World First players will not be complaining about having something less to deal with, I do suspect that this could potentially be a disappointment for high-end Mythic Plus only players. As a more mainstream player, however, I'm actually pretty happy with this. Having 3.5 weeks, including early access, to prepare and get some gear for the Mythic Plus campaign actually works very well for me, and it will help to reduce the gear gap between people who are willing to grind for 16 hours a day and those who have real lives and all that inconvenient stuff to deal with. In the past, Blizzard dealt with Heroic Week by capping Mythic Plus rewards at a +6, but with the changes to Mythic Plus difficulty, a +6 back then is now the equivalent of being in that range that Mythic 0 now covers. I also feel that this approach has done a pretty good job of threading the needle when it comes to making sure that folks with early access have content that's worth playing while minimising the possible advantages they get over folks with delayed access. When Blizzard promised that there would be no advantages, that was obviously a pipe dream, but this approach really does seem to limit that advantage massively and provides opportunities for folks to catch up. I do think that any residual benefits that people with early access do get will very quickly disappear at the start of the season. At least that's for the competitive content. That gold making related content, I'm not so sure that there won't be an advantage there. It's also very welcome to see Blizzard both maintain the accelerated unlock schedule for LFR, but also to start unlocking during Heroic Week and not wait till the Mythic Raid opens as they used to in BFA and Shadowlands. Back when Blizzard announced the story mode, they said it would unlock with the final wing, and seeing them rethink that and opening it up with the Mythic Raid is really nice to see, albeit I would still have preferred to have seen them open it the first week. The reason that the developers don't do that, I suspect, is that they are worried that players would just do it on story mode instead of experiencing it first with the guilds. And they would be right. We would. But I don't think that's a bad thing. In my experience, even as a lower focus player, I don't really have time to notice the story aspects of a raid due to a mix of the social pressures of keeping up with a diverse group, most of whom don't care about story, and the fact that the raid and dungeons just aren't a good storytelling tool. In my view, this means that even if I did clear the raid on day one, I'd still want to do this mode so it can at least try to follow the story. Tying the storyline to group content severely limits the design space for what is the most important part of their narrative, and I would rather see Blizzard lean hard into using the story mode to enable them to improve how they deliver the climaxes of those storylines. Anyways, what do all of you think about the new schedule? Is the longer wait for Mythic Plus going to put a damper on the start of the expansion for you, or are you looking forwards to see what they do with their story mode? Let me know in the comments down below. Just before I move on, if you're wondering what's going away in the pre-patch, while the major season titles and achievements like PvP, Gladiator, Cutting Edge, Ahead of the Curve have gone, the mount rewards from the raid, including the Mythic mount and the Heroic mount skin, are still obtainable until the 26th, as is the Keystone Master mount and the Mythic Plus portals. One thing that is a little bit unclear is what happens with folks in early access. Surely they are not going to allow level 80 characters to go back and hard carry a Dragonflight Raid or Mythic Plus dungeon, right? Seriously though, if you're interested in those mounts, do keep in mind that the Heroic skin and the KSM mount will no longer be obtainable when the new expansion starts, and the Mythic mount will switch to being a 1% drop, which will make it much harder to obtain. One final bit of information Blizzard did unveil was the dungeon gear drop levels. Now, much of this is pretty much what you would expect, but one thing that did stand out to me is that to get Myth Track gear from the Mythic Plus weekly vault, you will now have to do a plus 10 dungeon. That's up from the current 8. And this means that you will be dealing with both the fortified and tyrannical affixes at the same time. While Blizzard didn't mention the levels that crests will drop, the community has previously data mined that the new gilded crests, which are the ones that will be replacing aspect crests, start dropping at a plus 9. So the move upwards on the myth track to 10 was honestly something that was a little bit expected. Despite all of the release challenges, Blizzard still did find the time to drop another beta build. Like recent builds, this one focuses heavily in class tuning, but we did also get to see the new Mythic Plus affix Oblivion that was data mined last week. This affix spawns 10 orbs that fire at trash packs. Players can intercept these orbs for a group-wide stacking buff that awards 2% mastery and 1% leech for 20 seconds with every stack. If the orbs hit the mobs, they instead get a 10% damage reduction. And so yes, if you miss all of the orbs, well, that's going to be rough. That said, I do think that this is a much better way to take affixes if we must have them. The mechanic seems reasonably straightforward, and while the punishment for a mistake is high, it's not oppressively high, assuming you don't miss all of the orbs. The Voidbound affix also got some nice changes, with the punishment for failure being nerfed from a 10% damage increase every 3 seconds to a 5% increase every 2 seconds. And the reward for success now grants a 20% cooldown reduction in addition to the 20% crit chance increase. It's not clear to me if Oblivion is replacing the Ascendant affix or if we can expect to have more than 2 affixes. Personally, I'm hoping that this is a replacement, as these 2 affixes are a massive improvement on Ascendant, which in my view was far too complex for a +2 entry level dungeon. Now, one notable discovery on the beta is a change to the Myth Track gearing. Currently, Myth Track gear has 4 upgrade stages, but on the beta that's now been increased to 6. This does mean that Myth Track gear can be upgraded to match the Mythic Raid very rare drop levels, which means that Mythic Plus players may be able to close the gap between the Mythic Raiders. This does come at a potentially very large cost though, as combined with the announced change to Mythic Plus drops, players balloon +10 and above may find themselves having to upgrade their gear 5 steps instead of 2, more than doubling the number of crests needed. Along with this, the crafted gear levels haven't changed as yet. Now, it is possible that Blizzard have still to adjust them, but as it stands, the gap between the best crafted gear and the best gear drops will now be a full 10 item levels. This all combines to make crafted gear look quite unappealing for higher level play. I personally found in Dragonflight that my interest in crafted gear does change depending on how the crafted gear compares to the Mythic track. In Seasons 1 and 3, I made do with just my 2 embellished items, but in Season 3, where the crafted and myth track gear topped out at the same item level, I ended up with 6 crafted places. And in Season 4, the combination of the Awakened track items and the shorter season has led me to pretty much opt out of getting any crafted items. Don't get me wrong, the embellished items in Season 4 were still better overall, but the 4 aspect crest cost felt far too high when I could spend those crests upgrading drop. I am conscious that we may be missing part of an overall picture here, but we can only give feedback based on what is presented to us and not what Blizzard may or may not change in the future. So here we go. As someone who does shoot for myth track gear from Mythic Plus, these changes as they stand will make crafted gear very unappealing, even if embellishments are strong. Spending 4 of the new gilded crests to interact with a system that honestly doesn't feel super fun to me as a buyer, when demand for those crests and gear drops will be so much higher, just really doesn't seem to make much sense to me. Finally, on the data mining front, and we got to see what is likely to be the new expansion's login screen. The current login screen in the pre-patch, when it was unveiled in the beta, had a pretty negative to mixed reaction, in part because it's a major departure from the more in-game world scenes that we're all used to. And the good news is that it now appears that this isn't going to be the screen that we'll have to look at least for the next 18 months or so. It is tempting to think that this change is in reaction to that feedback, and that is always a possibility. But even back when the current pre-patch screen was unveiled, quite a few folks in the community did point out that it very much looked like it was designed to be something that would open up and reveal something behind it. There are of course no guarantees when it comes to data mining, but it very much looks like those predictions may turn out to be correct, with most likely the new version that being unveiled with the new expansion, which if it turns out to be the case, I personally think will be a really cool thing that they've done. Well, that's all for this week. With the launch of the pre-patch event next week and Blizzard now in the final stages of preparing for the main expansion, and I suspect that the pace of news is going to pick up a lot. If you want to catch my weekly news episodes, which I release every Saturday, then do make sure to hit the subscribe button and also the bell icon to get notified when they go live. Subscribing is by far the best way to support a channel like mine. And if you found this week's update informative, fun, or interesting, or if it's just made you a bit mad, then do let me know by hitting the like icon. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.